Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its mission? To explore strange new worlds, to discover new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
When Star Trek first appeared on television in 1966, there was no such thing as a personal computer. The viewer could get no closer to Gene Roddenberry's world than his or her imagination. Now, however, computer technology allows anyone who owns a computer to not just watch, but to participate in the adventures and interact with the crew of the Enterprise. Not so long ago, one person, with the aid of one or two programs and a creative flair, could design, develop, and market the next generation of computer games. In this age of faster computers, more complex programming languages, and demands by players for ever more complicated adventures, this is no longer true. The age of multimedia has arrived, and with it, the need for larger budgets, longer development times, and a team of talented individuals in a variety of crafts. Just what does it take to create a game the size and complexity of Interplay's Star Trek Judgment Rites?
Consumers of today's computer products, especially entertainment products, have come to expect a great deal from them. Computer games now have fully rendered graphics, and they have the highest quality possible sound. And also, the gamer is expecting a very plausible storyline. So with all of that in mind, we spared no expense to guarantee that not just the gamer, but the Star Trek fan, who's also a gamer, would have a very satisfying experience from playing this game.
Let's put the pieces together and see how Judgment Rites was made. It starts, of course, with an idea. Brian Fargo, founder and president of Interplay Productions.
What we want to do is create a game that was a simulation of the original Star Trek series as opposed to a simulation of Star Trek. And so in doing so, we wanted to do something that was very episodic in format so that people could sit down each night and solve an episode and up to its final resolution by using their brains and their skills and do it over a series of 8 different episodes that are all linked together with a common theme. We felt that this was the closest you could get to simulating the original series rather than doing one big adventure that would take, say, 40 or 50 hours to complete.
The plot of Judgment Rites is one familiar to science fiction fans. An alien race, the Brassicans, are conducting a test. The subjects of the test are the crew of the Enterprise and the crew of a Klingon warship. How they conduct themselves during the test will determine the fate of both civilizations for centuries to come. Failure could mean isolation, or worse.
Rusty Butchert was the producer for the original floppy disk-based version of Star Trek Judgment Rites. And he produced a very wonderful game where the story is based on the Klingons and the Federation and how they're being evaluated by this race who call themselves the Brassicans. All 8 episodes that we present in Star Trek Judgment Rites are set against this backdrop. And in several episodes, there are confrontations with the Klingons or with Trelane or with some other characters. And the Brassicans are testing the mettle of Kirk and his crew. And at the same time, they're testing the abilities of the Klingons to handle those situations. When finally, at the end, the crew of the Klingons and the crew of the Enterprise are brought together, where they face the Brassicans and face a mental challenge, which the player now has to think in terms of, if I was Kirk in this situation, what would be the best thing for me to do?
Crafting the overall plotline and the individual stories falls to the scripters. Marco Green, author of the Judgment Rites scenario, Museum Piece.
Designing a computer adventure game is a rather imposing task. It's not just that you're writing and designing a single story at one time. A scenario is essentially several stories going on at the same time. It's kind of a good way to visualize it. Imagine a tree and the story starts at the base of the tree, and every time you work up and a player makes an action or decision, the story and scenario branch out. And some of these branches can have radical changes to the entire story. Some will lead to some sort of failure. You can put yourself in a position that not even James T. Kirk can get you back out. When you design a game like this, you don't want just one answer. There shouldn't be any one single right path. This essentially wouldn't be much different than watching TV or a movie. Then you know where the story starts and ends. This we want to create something where you can have several different endings, again, very different endings to your entire story. This creates a lot of complexity to the work because you're not only working off these story branches, but at the same time you have to take into account things like the computer interface, how the player is actually going to be able to look at an item, what he sees when he looks at the item. Can he pick something up? Can he manipulate it? All these sort of computer functions also make an effect on your story and what you're trying to tell and how you tell it. All that is just for one story, one scenario. Now in Judgment Rites we had 8 scenarios, and to top on all these other little complexities, all 8 scenarios had to have a connecting thread. So that meant that even if one scenario had maybe 4 different endings, each one of those endings had to logically progress this overriding story thing. So again, it's just one more thing to throw in this entire mix, which meant that all the writers, Liz Danforth, Mike Stackpole, Scott Benny, and I, we all had to do quite a bit of communication on this project.
Once the plot line and episodes have been decided on, the next critical element is the visual one. Graphic art, the backgrounds, characters, and objects, is a crucial aspect to any multimedia project. It is a time-consuming process which requires excruciating detail to provide a rich visual atmosphere. So, how do we get this from this? Todd Camasta, head of Interplay's art department, explains.
Star Trek Judgment Rites was a sequel from the original 25th anniversary. So we had already established a look and a style. It has also what made our job easier is the fact that it is an established look from the 70s. The series is 70s high tech. So we already had a style. We had personalities already established by famous actors. Our job was to take that interface from the first game and to put it into the sequel.
Sometimes there are some people on a project that are just better animators or better background people, and what we try to do is to use those strengths to make an animation better or make the process run smoother, faster, whatever. On one part of this project, I was basically a fill artist, where a person I was teamed up with was a much better animator, and he would go ahead and do the line art, and I will take his line art and color it in. And to me, that's fine. That's part of the art process. I don't mind doing things like that. It might seem like grunt work to somebody else, but it's part of what we do as artists, and you just do it.
The sequel for Judgment Rites, we put more humor into it. We knew that there would be voices. It made it a little bit easier, a little more fun. And I think that was the key to managing 11 people, is to make it fun. And they all had the same goal. When you're doing a sequel, it is a lot more easier to have a goal, have a finishing line, have the light at the end of the tunnel. So it made it a little more easier for me on the second run, managing this many people.
Once the team has created the visual elements of the game, it's time to add voices to the characters. Here, I'm taping voiceover dialogue from the Judgment Rites script. Unlike a movie or television plot where there's only one outcome, a linear plot line, if you will, in this interactive adventure, I frequently have to read 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 alternate texts for the same situation. As the player makes decisions that affect the direction a game scenario will take, the appropriate response will be played. Recording and then preparing the over 13,000 separate lines of dialogue is the task of Charles Deenan, and his staff of sound engineers.
Star Trek Judgment Rites, the largest voice editing project Interplay Audio Department has ever taken on, includes over 240 hours of recorded material, 7 binders of scripts, over 3 months of work, and it all ends up on one single CD-ROM. Beginning with the raw tapes, which was recorded at some of Hollywood's finest studios, we then transferred the audio into our computers and began working on the balance and tone of the sound in each character. Once everything is transferred into our computers, we use them to manipulate and create a tone and balance so that when it comes out on your speakers, it's the best possible sound, and you feel like you're in the game.
Recording the 13,000 lines in Judgment Rites required 28 actors in addition to the familiar cast from Star Trek. The actors were recorded at different times and in a variety of studios. To ensure that the dialogue would fit together seamlessly and flow naturally, Interplay hired professional voiceover director and performer Michael McConaughey of The Voice Works to coordinate and direct the effort.
The experience of directing these people was pretty phenomenal for me because, as everyone else in the project, I saw these people as heroes from the time I was a lot younger than I am now. And the opportunity to work with them, to be accepted as an equal with them in this thing, was just an astounding experience. The idea of directing someone like Leonard Nimoy or William Shatner, who are quite capable directors in their own right, was a little daunting, but they were exceptionally forgiving and very accepting. And there was not a clinker in this cast of the original cast of Star Trekkers. They were all, without exception, giving and quick. I mean, at this point, obviously, they know what they're doing. But as far as the supporting actors we cast, the 28 people who had really a rough job, because in many cases they were tripling roles, which everyone says, well, you know, a good actor can do it, but it's a lot different to do it, as in this case, working in a vacuum almost. It was the actor in the booth and the director out front, and there's no one in there to react with. And sometimes we're able to set up the circumstances for the actor, and sometimes not. And these people did not have 25 years of experience to pull back on. But they snapped in very quickly, and in some instances, in the space of 15 minutes, they'd be a human security guard or talking broccoli, depending on the scenario. And it was an awful lot of fun, both to work with them and for them to work in this, because it was cutting-edge technology, and it was Star Trek.
We now have 3 of the critical elements in the making of Judgment Rites. There's still one overriding job to be finished, however. The pieces have to be assembled into a game, something with which the player can interact and control. That's the task of an unusual group of latter-day wizards.
By the time all the parts get to the programmer's been involved in the original design. He's helped to give the artists and the musicians and the game designers and the writers limits on what you can technically do. Then it's the programmer's job to somehow exceed those limits, because the artists and the musicians and everybody else will naturally want 110% of what you told them they could have. So now it's our job to somehow put it all together, come up with that 110%, and still make it a great game where you're playing it and you forget that you're playing a game.
We've looked at the parts. Now let's see what one short scene looks like when all the pieces are put together.
Captain, the computer is locked into an infinite loop. It will continue playing the game until it defeats itself. I can interrupt the moves and input my own.
Try rook to queen's level 3. That will threaten its bishop.
We are maintaining a stable position with its game. We may attain a stalemate if we want that.
I don't want to lose. Let's support our queen with a pawn.
That was not a very good move, Captain. Quite poor. I would not enter any chess tournaments if I were you, Captain.
Spock, you wound me. Now watch me take his rook with my knight on queen's level 1.
Mate in 3 moves, Jim. Actually, 4 moves, Doctor. but it has become irrelevant. It has resigned.
The brief scene from Star Trek Judgment Rites you just witnessed took 12 people and several days to complete. When you add up all the scenes, the actors, sound and video engineers, artists, and programmers needed to put them all together, you begin to realize why a modern multimedia title takes months of effort and is such a monumental task.
There's literally thousands of details, and when it all comes together, it's very, very gratifying. But I suppose the most awesome responsibility we have is having inherited the vision of Gene Roddenberry from his original show. There are some great expectations for us. And when we meet those expectations and have a great game that people can enjoy, that is the biggest thrill of all. And I hope that people who play the game have experienced the same kind of thrill that the people, myself and the rest of the staff, experienced while we were putting the game together.
In this brief time together, we've examined how the various elements of Judgment Rites, from concept to finished game, were pulled together by the combined efforts of dozens of gifted individuals. We hope you'll enjoy this, the second of Interplay's computer sojourns with the crew of the Enterprise. Already, more Star Trek games are in production. As you help guide Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and the rest of the crew past the tough spots in Star Trek Judgment Rites, be gentle. We'll need them all on the planet Vulcan for the next adventure.
I was a freelance writer who got tired of writing scripts about nothing at all, and I began reading science fiction. And among the science fiction I read was David Swift's about the Lilliputians. And I began to see from that you could write about something in science fiction. And so I dreamed up the Star Trek idea so that I could comment on man and society. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They thought that I made it too complicated. They felt I had offered them a wagon train to the stars, which I had, because I wanted to sell it. And Westerns were very big at the time. And I felt that I'd double-crossed them. I'd written them this thing about where the mind went in certain ways, and they wanted someone with bare knuckles in a fist fight. They turned it down, but they did like some parts of it. The first time they said they'd ever felt like they were truly in a spaceship. And they turned it down. They said, now, if you will really give us the equivalent of a Western, we can put you back to work on it. So we made them a second show, which had a lot of science fiction elements too, but at least it ended up with Bill Shatner in a bare-knuckle fist fight in which he beats a godlike figure in a fair brawl. And I thought it was a terrible idea, but it worked and it met their needs, and that started us. We sold Star Trek with it. Jeffrey was a good actor, and it was good to have him on the show. However, his wife kind of felt that science fiction was a little beneath him. And so they didn't want to go on to a second pilot. Bill Shatner then came available, thank God, because Bill did a marvelous job, as we know from 20 years of reruns. And with it behind him, we put the series together. It was both. It was sort of a little fakery on my part, too, because Westerns were exciting then, and they could understand wagon train, whereas very few people in those days read science fiction, and almost no network executives or studio heads. And, they thought in terms of Buck Rogers and of naked girls in silver breastplates, and nothing about the heart of real science fiction is, stories about people and ideas. And so I had to fake a little bit to get them to watch it. Well, I had enough up and downs, so when I came back to Paramount and we started talking about a second run of Star Trek, which became The Next Generation, I said I wasn't interested. I just, in all of those years of doing 78 Star Trek episodes, the emotional cost was too much. I was being censored because they claimed we had open mouth kisses, and they were measuring We had this whole show thrown off the air because a ladies' navel was seen in it. And although the next year the networks came out with Laugh In, and belly buttons were wild then. It's a ridiculous way for a writer to lead his life, to have junior executives who don't know writing and don't know science fiction telling you cannot do this or you must do this. I'm an artist, basically. That's what artists have done since time immemorial. That's why you've always had artists, even with cavemen and so on. It is a basic and necessary function for humanities. Artists explain everything that we see and explain why it's important. And art is not a thing of deft, beautiful writings or sculpturing of music. It's a thing of comment. I had always been a fan, speaking of Westerns, of Gunsmoke, and with their cast of Kitty and Doc and Chester and so on. And I noticed how well that worked over episode after episode. And I thought, if I ever do a series, I want to do the same type of thing where the characters are like Uncle Joe drops by, and there's Dad, and there's Brave Brother, and so on. And so I really cast my Star Trek people as a television family. And you knew what their secrets were, and you would laugh at the same joke every week, as you do in real life. Captain Kirk is Captain Hornblower of the sailing ships, who was a great hero, and Hemingway said is the most exciting adventure fiction in the human language. Myself, I had screwed up so many times in life through emotions. I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write someone who is totally emotionless and logical? Chekhov came on the show because I'd read something, and someone had sent me a copy of a Russian newspaper in which they said after our first year, the ugly Americans are at it again. We were the first people in space, but the Americans don't even have a Russian aboard this crew. So I wrote the Russian aboard the crew and sent a copy of it to the Communist Youth newspaper, which they never answered. When I was trying to find a name for Nichelle Nichols, and thought of the Swahili for freedom, which is uhuru, and decided to feminize it, make it uhura. I knew I could hear her shriek of joy from across town. I was pleased that in those days, when you couldn't get even blacks on television, that I not only had a black, but a black woman and a black officer. And that'll show them. Great affection I have for Asians and what they do and the important part they play in the world. And I just could not have a group of Earth people without including that great, one half or more of the Earth continents. Scots have always been shipbuilders and ship engineers and so on. And that was a bow to tradition and a great fun bow too. Because it speaks to some basic human needs that there is a tomorrow. It's not all going to be over with a big flash and a bomb. That the human race is improving. That we have things to be proud of as humans. No, ancient astronauts did not build the pyramids. Human beings built them because they're clever and they work hard. And Star Trek is about those things. I feel that my principal love is writing, words, language. Probably if I had started directing early, I would have enjoyed it very much, because certainly the director, particularly in motion pictures, is the man in charge of a production, which is sort of the reason I decided to, after producing the first Star Trek movie, I decided to go back to television, because in television, the writer-producer is the man. And I was more interested in getting my ideas over than I was in making a movie that looked good. Well, I'm very close to the people at NASA and places like that, as at MIT and so on. And I learn a lot from them, and they call me with ideas. As a matter of fact, one of the advanced planners of NASA is arriving in town today, and I'll be having some meetings with him next week. They've been very helpful. I was very afraid when I started Star Trek that scientists and NASA people would say, "Oh God, you're so inaccurate and you're so wrong," and I almost hated to deal with them at first until I discovered that they're not like that. They're intelligent, and because they're intelligent, they understand the problems of show business. And they understand that I had to appeal to a mass audience as well as a specialized audience. And it's been a love feast. Someone asked me some years ago, before I'd ever gotten any kind of a check for Star Trek reruns, what is your profit on the series? And I said, the greatest profit of all, the people that I could not pay to meet and know, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and the NASA people and the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab where I'm welcome. Wow, you can't buy that. Far too many people believed, and many still believe, that they're a bunch of teenagers who wear odd clothing and give odd signs and things, but they're not. Trekkers include businessmen, bank presidents, stockbrokers, college professors, and a large number of astronauts, of whom I saw a couple 2 nights ago who were out here. Trekkers are really... It also includes the kids, and God bless them and let them have fun. But it's people who sort of believe in the general type of thing we're talking about in Star Trek, that the human species is to be admired, and it is really going to go somewhere. Well, the fans were wild for the idea, and I kind of liked the idea too. I was broke. The people were not exactly standing in line to hire the guy. I was a much sought-after freelance writer until I did Star Trek. Then the story got around town that I had done this crazy series that practically broke the studio from its costs and all that sort of thing, and I couldn't get much work. I figured from the movie maybe I could get involved to the point of making some money, which my wife and I desperately needed to pay our mortgage and so on. And so I guess I was encouraged by greed as much as by a chance to see what Star Trek could do on the big screen and with an adequate budget and so on. And I'm glad we went along that way. And when I didn't want to produce them, Harv Bennett came along, and he did a very good job. He was a very experienced producer, and I was delighted to leave that in his hands, with myself remaining keeping the consulting function. First Star Trek series, we treated such things as mixed races aboard the spaceship, and whether women could be in charge of anything and so on. And when we shocked the audience by saying yes to those questions. In the new series, with new characters and new attitudes, we have a chance to deal with still more important questions, and questions of the 80s and the 90s, such as the question of terrorists. The question of last year we touched on the question of drugs. Why do people take drugs? Because they're bad? Obviously, there's more to it than that. I want to touch on the problems of superstitions which rule the world and set people bombing each other. I respect them. There are all sorts of trekkers. From teenagers to businessmen to professionals, and they're people who want this. Largely, they want the same sort of things out of humanity that I want. And it's strange to go to a meeting of people who are some of whom are wearing strange clothes and making strange signs and so on, and find out that they're very serious and they care deeply about who and what this creature human is. Well, they kept it alive through their clubs and their various meetings and so on, and for which But they kept it alive because they enjoyed doing these things. They enjoy their conventions just as much as veterans enjoy their conventions. I've never let Trekkers, though, run Star Trek, because Star Trek is an artistic endeavor that is best run by the professionals. And I will listen to Trekkers and Trekkies. I will listen to the guard at the gate and get many good ideas those ways. But no, I will never make a change in Star Trek because I think it will please the Trekkers. In that way lies prostitution. And you cannot be a good producer, writer, or anything if you first thing you ask is, what do they want? That's what prostitutes do. I write what I think they should have and what I think they'll enjoy. And thank God I've been right occasionally. Because it says it's not all over. It's not all, we're not going to go up in smoke. We're going to make it. Because it says the human adventure has just begun. That's it in a nutshell. I would hope there are bright young people growing up all the time who will bring to it levels and areas that were beyond me. And I don't feel jealous about that at all. I think that, as I was saying, Hollywood and the motion picture industry is a remarkable thing. And it'll go on without any of us and get better and better and better, because that really is the human condition, is to improve and improve. Get lost, to go through the things I went through with network executives and so on, to do it all over again. On the first show, and on the original Star Trek, I practically lost my family from working so many 12-hour days, 14-hour days, 7 days a week. And I said, you can't pay me enough to do that. But then they said, hey, but suppose we did it in a way in which they call syndication, in which we don't have a network, and we don't have all those people. And Paramount was saying to me, and we guarantee to you that you will be in charge of the show. I asked, who would be the censor? They said, you. You've been around television long enough to know what doesn't play and what can't. And very slowly I began to be, and then it occurred to me that we couldn't possibly do it with the old cast. The old cast was doing movies. You couldn't afford them in the first place. Nor could you do it with the old cast, because the crew people you have who need encouragement, who need to have their thing. People don't just work for money. The mixers, the cameramen, and all of those people have to have their show. And with a new cast, it could be that way. It could have new ideas and so on. The whole group could say, as they say today, it's our Star Trek. And you desperately need that. After doing all of those episodes, are there new things you can do? My God, yes. The basis of our series is the galaxy, and there's quite a few stories out there. I decided that we can't have people smoking. Although I smoked in those days, the networks advertised cigarettes. I said, man, we'll just be too smart to keep this up. So I said, no one smokes, which caused lots of problems. I feel the same thing about drinking today, and I hasten to say I drink and enjoy it. We're too smart to continue that for long, and we have invented for the barroom something called synthanol, which acts just the same as alcohol, makes you feel that you can be a lover or wise or all the things that alcohol does, but it's only temporary. You with a force of will, you can shove it aside and you're as sober as you ever were. So our ship will have synthanol. No, it makes me nervous because it isn't good enough what we did, and we've got to now build on that and make it better. Once you begin sticking your tongue out, literally or figuratively, at people, your brain goes too, and you end up with a show that is crap. And I want Star Trek to do the things it can do. I've never felt that I had it made. What we can expect in the future is to continue to explore the human creature and what our problems is, and the things I talked about, the place superstition is playing in destroying harmony between nations and so on. Also, I'd like to get a little bit into the absurdities of 20th century politics, which we can look back on from the 24th century. And we'll consider the 20th century something that we had to go through, but our people will see it as something they're glad to be rid of, you know. Paramount said, we will back you in this, and by God, they did. And I've had nothing but good treatment out of them. I do feel sometimes they were nervous about giving the keys to the asylum to a writer, but despite their nervousness, they stood true to their word, and I really respect them and thank them. There's a guy who knows something about what Star Trek should be, but doesn't know it all, and I see Star Trek as part of the continuing education of Gene Roddenberry. I learn new things every day about science and humanity and history. They're paying me to go to college and paying me very richly, and I thank them.
I don't know what kind of programming in general is being done by Hollywood studios for interactive, but I think Star Trek lends itself to interactive. Star Trek is a vehicle that fans have been attracted to and have wanted to interact with in one way or another for the last 26 or 27 years. The technology now makes it possible for them to really do that. We've had over the years Star Trek attractions at theme parks around the country, for example, where a small group at a time of young people would be put into Star Trek uniforms, get on a stage and act out a line or two with a group of other actors, and then have themselves injected into a Star Trek videotape that they can take home and show their family. Here I am with Mr. Spock, here I am with Captain Kirk, or whatever. Saying this line or that, there I am, that kind of thing. So there's always been, for many years, that kind of desire. Everybody knows that there have been hundreds and hundreds of Star Trek conventions over the years, and people come out to meet and talk about Star Trek and exchange ideas about Star Trek and watch Star Trek episodes and films together over and over again until they know the dialogue well enough to read it back to the TV set. To listen to speakers who have had anything to do with Star Trek. If anybody who's been a visitor on the set of Star Trek has become a celebrity in his hometown. There's a tremendous need to interact with these people because we are presenting a world that touches the imagination. We're presenting a positive future world that a lot of people would like to be in touch with. And I think now the technology makes it possible for them to really feel that they are involved in a very real physical way with the story that's playing itself out in an interactive process. The appeal of entertainment on CD-ROM is the switch from passive to active. Instead of switching channels to see another show, you go to work on this one and change the program, change the course of the event of the plot. From an actor's point of view, it's a process of making it all work through vocal work. We are not involved physically on camera in this particular program. On the other hand, it's a little bit more complicated because each line has to serve, each reading of each line of dialogue has to serve a number of purposes, because the story could diverge from that line on into different directions depending on what the viewer chooses the plot to go to. I think that we have a big advantage in that, having played these characters and having lived with these characters for a long period of time, we tend to know how the character would respond in certain situations. If we were in the process of creating a new character, I think it would be more difficult. I think we'd have to do more research, more study, more discussion about, well, how's the character going to act if he's in trouble? How's the character going to act when he gets out of trouble? We know the answers to those questions. We've been with these characters for a long time. We know the relationships between the characters, the relationships between Spock and McCoy and the captain and Spock, all the rest of us with Uhura and Scotty and Sulu and Checo. We understand what these relationships are all about. They go on like a soft glove. You put it on and you go to work. So I think we have the advantage in that respect over other people who might have to be creating new characters for this medium. It seems to me that the incredible challenges are for the writers, because the writers have to design and develop so many different tracks of the story. When you make a motion picture or an episode of television, you're creating one story track, and that's going to be the story that you tell. In this medium, you're creating several story tracks, and each of those story tracks can branch off into different directions, so it multiplies geometrically. And there's a lot more work to do, starting with the writing, a lot more work to do with the recording and the editing of all this material. It's quite an enormous task, very complicated. I don't know exactly what will be happening in theatrical interactive, but I think certainly in this process in CD-ROM interactive, it's going to be light years ahead of the theatrical interactive, if it ever happens theatrically, because I think the cost of doing it theatrically would be too enormous. So I think this is the ideal medium for it. I can't say I was really surprised. I thought this has been some time in coming, and certainly as time has come. Our stories lend themselves to this kind of imaginative adventure. The plot lines that can be created in this kind of a process are I think, excitingly obvious. I thought, well, here it is. We've been hearing about all these various means of delivering information, of capturing information on a disk, and the quality moving so quickly, the technology moving so quickly. I'm not surprised. We're here doing it. We seem to be in exactly the right place at the right time, doing exactly the right thing. I would think they'll feed each other. I would think that Star Trek, the original classic episodes as well as the Next Generation episodes, will be running on television for the rest of time that we know, and I would think that the interactive will lead people to be interested in the original episodes and vice versa. I'm not sure about that. I do believe that interactive I do believe that interactive in a purely theatrical situation, where people pay a price to walk into a theater and sit down, will have certain limitations. I think the cost of producing interactive films, and I think there have been some experiments which have not been too gloriously successful, where audiences vote on how the next scene should be played or how the story should evolve from here. I'm not sure that that's what people want when they pay their $7 or $6 or $5 or $4, whatever they pay, to sit down in the theater and watch a story. I think they do go for a collective experience where everybody experiences the same story. On the other hand, I think it's very exciting in terms of use of computer technology at home. For the interactive we're talking about specifically. I do believe that there are times when I or my children or grandchildren are watching television and flipping through the channels, and you go through now if you have cable television and you subscribe to some services, you might have 20 channels, I guess, or maybe 25 or even 30 channels, and somebody shuts off the TV and says, well, there's nothing on. Amazing. What we're really saying is there's nothing on that captures our imagination tonight. There's nothing on that we really must see. So perhaps what we're looking for is something that we want to do, something that we can affect, that rather than being passive, rather than sitting and watching stuff that somebody says is what we should be seeing tonight. Maybe there's something that we want to get our hands on. Maybe we want to say, well, what would happen if this would go this way? Or what would happen if, let me work with that. Let me explore that. What's hidden in here? What are the secret tracks and avenues in here that I don't know about yet? That's, I think, is very exciting stuff. Very different from just turning on to see what's on. Turning it on to see what you can do with what's on. And what's hidden and what is not immediately obvious, but you discover for yourself, I think is a very exciting process. Well, yes, and using very professional visual techniques and using the professional actors who play these roles and guiding them through the adventure and watching them make mistakes that you've led them to and watching them solve problems that you've helped them solve by picking up certain clues and certain evidence, I think is a very exciting new experience. The possibilities for imaginative stories are endless. Much like in the animation business, and yet even far more complex and credible. As a person in my business, you become very much aware that anytime you create a story idea that has any imagination or size or canvas or scope to it, you are also creating budgetary issues. You're creating costs. Anytime you say, well, there are 1,000 people listening to a person do a speech and you want to shoot that scene, those 1,000 people are going to cost you a lot of money. So somebody in the budget department comes down and says, can you do with 100? Or can you do with 50? You know, and everything starts to shrink down to what one can afford. Well, to draw the animation for the 1,000 may not cost much more, if anything more, than drawing the 50 and having them replicated 20 times, and you've got your 1,000 people. So the opportunity to tell larger stories, more exciting, more complex stories, to give more texture, to give more scope, more size, more mystery, more magic. The opportunities are endless. It just depends on how vivid the imagination is and how much energy you have to put into it, as opposed to money to put into it. So in that respect, it's very exciting. You can do stories, you can develop ideas that might have been much too costly to do before this medium came along. I've had a good time with Star Trek and Spock over the years, and I consider myself very lucky to have become connected with a project that has had the lifespan that Star Trek has had. Did we know when we were making the original series that we would now be, 27, 28 years after going on the air, that we would still be around working the Star Trek territory? No, certainly not. Couldn't have predicted that. But I did know, I think I can honestly say, I did know when we were making the original episodes that there was a durable substance to what we were doing, because the stories had a certain kind of durability, a certain kind of integrity. We were dealing with issues which are eternal issues, not simply issues of today or this week. And we were not, I don't think, trendy. We were doing sort of classic ideas, dealing with large classic thematic ideas, social issues, territorial issues, issues of population, issues of hate, greed, vengeance, the very large passions that came down to us from the Greek drama, from ancient times. So I did feel that the stuff that we were doing was durable, as compared to some other television series of the day, which were more topical and maybe even hotter and more exciting and more popular at the time, but not anywhere near as durable. And for that reason, I find myself not surprised that we're still doing it. I'm very pleased that I've been connected with something that had that kind of longevity. We are now, in a way, seeing the same kind of technological revolution in entertainment that happened when sound came in and replaced talkies. It's just as great a step forward, greater even. Because you could sit and enjoy a movie even before sound, even before talkies. But now I think the changes, the advancements are by great leaps and bounds today, as opposed to being able to walk instead of crawl. We are now able to take gigantic leaps technologically. to see some of the things that are being done in special effects these days by a lot of companies, instead of perhaps just one or two companies that are experimenting with and crudely performing certain kinds of what we at one time thought were wonderful special effects. Now there are a lot of companies that are capable of doing it very quickly. They're mastering these techniques. Computers have given us the power, the electronic power, to do enormous accomplishments technologically. So I think we really are moving very, very quickly towards whatever the mind can imagine that we can accomplish. One of the things about Star Trek that has, I think, made it so successful is that we have portrayed a successful and exciting future for mankind. And I think that's what we're seeing now in the technology. The technology is leading us to that. I think CD-ROM is the next logical step in technological evolution, obviously. The difficulty for me in moving from acting to directing was that the first two movies that I made as a director, I was also performing in the film. So I was doing what a lot of other very successful and very talented people have done before, which is to act and direct in the same movie. Woody Allen has done it. Clint Eastwood has done it. Chaplin certainly did it, movie after movie. I found it particularly difficult to do. And one of the very simple reasons for the difficulty was that my makeup when I do Spock, takes about 2 hours to put on. So in the morning, if the director had to be at work at 7 a.m., I had to get into a makeup chair at 5 a.m. to get my makeup done by 7 so that I could step out of the chair and start directing the movie. That would add 2 hours a day to what would be a long day anyway. It could be a 12 or 14-hour day, and add 2 hours for makeup. You've got a 14 or 16-hour work day, or longer sometimes. I'm much more comfortable doing either one or the other. And in fact, when we did Star Trek III, I worked very hard at designing a story where there was a minimal amount of Spock, frankly, in the movie, so that my first feature would be a little bit easier for me to direct and occasionally act. In Star Trek IV, I did a lot more on-camera work. And the movies that I've made since, I have avoided acting in for just that reason. I like both very, very much. I like acting and directing both. But for me, acting and directing on the same film is not a pleasure. It's a task. I'd rather do one or the other. That was the toughest part of the transition. The easiest part of the transition came because I have been around sets, movie sets, ever since the 50s. I've been at it for about 40 years. So I obviously have been around some very talented directors and watched a lot of very good people do the job and learn how to do it. The benefit that I had was that I had played Spock for many, many years before I stepped into this directing work. So I knew the character. It wasn't as though I was trying to create a new character and needed to look around to ask people, does this character work? I pretty much knew what makes Spock tick by the time I started directing the Star Trek films. So that helped a lot. I was acting around. I was, as they say, around in the labor pool. In the 60s, I had done a lot of television, an occasional feature. Actually had been in the business for about 15 years. I did an episode, I did a guest starring episode of The Lieutenant. Guest starred portraying a movie actor in an episode of The Lieutenant, which was Gene Roddenberry's series. And he was in the process of rounding up people to act in the pilot for Star Trek. And my agent called me. I never met Gene when I was making the show. He was away out of town somewhere, saw the show after it was finished shooting. My agent called me and said, I had a call from Gene Roddenberry. He says that he's developing a pilot for a television series, science fiction. He's interested in you, and you'll be hearing from him when he gets ready to cast. And I immediately put it totally out of mind. I thought, we're now talking about a guy who is developing a pilot, who thinks he has a role in that pilot that he might want to use me for. The pilot may never be shot in the first place. When it is, by the time it is shot, they'll probably change their mind 6 or 8 times about who should act in it, and then its chances of being sold are almost nil. At that time, there were a lot of pilots made, and very few were chosen, as they say. So I just put it out of mind. I'd been around long enough that I didn't put any stock in it. But sure enough, 3 or 4 or 5 months later, I was called to meet Gene Roddenberry at the studio. and I went to see him thinking that I was going to audition for a role. And when I got there, Gene started introducing me to a lot of department heads. This is our property department head. This is the person who's going to do our wardrobe. And I was looking at wardrobe designs. I was looking at props. I was taken to the stages and looked at sets. And I thought, they're going to shoot this thing. And I wonder when I'm going to be asked to read some scenes. And I never was. And he shook my hand and said, I hope you like what you've seen, and we'll be in touch. And I thought, I think he's telling me he wants me to do this job. You know? And that's pretty much the way it happened. He had seen the work that I did in The Lieutenant. He had seen some other episodic television work that I had done. He had rounded up some other films that I had appeared in and made the decision that I should be the guy. The network was extremely leery of a recurring character who you would see a lot of in a television series, who looked to them devilish, and they thought frightening to an audience. It was really interesting. In those days, I'm talking about 1964, I think was the first pilot. The concept for making a pilot for a television series was you bring together a group of 3 or 4 or 5 principal actors and actresses, each of whom represent a segment of your potential audience. The male lead should be the guy that the father in the American family can I relate to and identify with. The female should be the lady that the mother in the family can relate to and identify with. The kid in the show should be the person who appeals to the kids in the audience, and preferably this family should have a pet. And the pet should be a typical dog or whatever that'll come when you call it and bring you your slippers, you know. It was the American family kind of concept. Here's this guy with the pointed ears. And the feeling was, who in the American audience is going to relate to him? How many people out there have pointed ears? How many people, aren't there going to be people who think this guy is scary and devilish? And they actually asked Gene Roddenberry to first replace me and change the character, and then at least take the pointed ears away. And after we shot the pilot, and there were some sales brochures printed up for the network publicity department and sales department to show to potential sponsors, to show them the story of the series, what it would be about, and what the characters would look like. Because I was in the pilot, I was on the mailing list, and I got one of these things in the mail. And I opened it and I looked at it, and to my shock, my ears were round. I thought, what's wrong with this picture? There's something wrong here. My ears were perfectly rounded. And I called Gene and I said, have you seen these photographs? He said, yes. And I said, what does this mean? And he explained to me that they were concerned about this character. And in order not to offend anybody in the potential audience or potential sponsors, they had changed the look of the character in the photographs. They had taken away the arched eyebrows and made them look normal and taken the points off my ears. And I thought, that's the end of me. Obviously, they don't want me or my character in this show. But Gene persisted. And within about 5 or 6 weeks after the show went on the air, the mail for Spock was so heavy that the network did a total turnaround, and they were now calling Gene Roddenberry and saying, put him in more scenes. We want to see more of him. So it caused some anguish for the writers because we were already shooting. And typically, at the end of Act 2 of a 3-act episode of Star Trek, the way they were constructing these things was, Captain Kirk would say, well, there's a problem on the planet. I'm going to go down and solve this problem now, which meant that he would go down and deal with the heavy or the creature or whatever it was for the last act, and we'd be sitting up on the Enterprise biting our nails like, is it going to be okay? And now, because the network had decided they wanted to see more of Spock, he'd say, I'm going down to the planet. Spock, you come with me. So I would go down and stand around on the planet and watch him take care of the heavy until the writers were able to catch up with what was happening and integrate us successfully. I would come down and be a spectator, kind of trying to help him, but not really written into the scene yet because the writers hadn't caught up with this idea. So that was the process, and gradually we found our way, and then the Dr. McCoy irritation, McCoy and Spock being so different in personality. I used to say that McCoy and Spock, the two of them together, made a Kirk. You know, there was the logical side and the emotional side, and that was how the triangle kind of was structured. I think one of the wonderful things about the character, the way it was written and designed, was that it played to the audience's intelligence and appealed to the audience's intelligence. This is a bright character, and it makes people feel good that they get it. They understand how he's operating, how he's functioning. There's also another very, very important aspect of the Spock character, which is that he's half human, and he's fighting that all the time. He's trying to control that all the time. So you have this split and this tension, internal tension between the logical, precise, rational, scientific Vulcan side and the emotional human side. And I think that is a split that all of us humans understand about ourselves. We deal with these issues in everyday life. Should I get upset about this, or should I just try to work it through logically? That's a very human condition. Does this person hurt my feelings, or is there something here that I should I put that aside and deal with it in terms of what's the facts? What are we trying to accomplish here? Should I fly off the handle and act out, or just simply try to solve the problem? These are very human questions that we deal with every day. And my role in Interplay's game, obviously, is the character of Spock, and very classic role, very classic function, to help Captain Kirk solve problems, to provide information, to be a sort of a different point of view for him. He looks at a situation in a certain way. I might say, Captain, you should be aware of that such and such. Or, Captain, I have discovered that so-and-so. Here's some information. Captain, I have certain tools that I can offer you. I have the ability to read a person's mind. I have the ability to do a neck pinch on a person and render that person unconscious. I have the ability to function as a computer under certain situations. I have the ability to interpret scientific data for you. What would be useful to you? What would you like? Would you like me to perform a function here that only a Vulcan or a scientist can perform? So in that way, it's very classic. Support the captain, help him solve problems, and be of as much use as I can be. I'm really very pleased with what Interplay's writers and designers have captured. I think that the people who are designing these games for Interplay are very much in touch with what really makes these characters and makes Star Trek tick. I think I have had a very easy time performing the material because I get what they're after, because I think they understand how the characters work with each other and what the characters' functions are. They certainly have captured Spock's attitude, his speech, his precision of mind, his sense of humor, which is very important, big part of the character, his interaction with Kirk, his interaction with McCoy. So I would say if I had a chance to speak to all of them, congratulations. I think they've done a great job.